Welcome, everybody. It is a little weird talking to about 100 people and not actually being able to see anybody, but we're going to give it a go anyway here. I am Scott Sperling. I'm the chair of Division 40's Education Advisory Committee and the vice chair of APA's Early Career Psychologist Committee. I'm excited to have you all join us today. I think that we're going to be able to put on a pretty good session and answer a lot of the questions that are circling around out there now regarding training and its relationships to jobs and licensure in this time of COVID. I don't want to take up too much time with intros because I do want to spend most of our time here getting to your questions, but I do want to again acknowledge you all for being here. Thank you for being here, taking the time to do this. Again, we will go through all the questions that were submitted during the registration process, but if you've got other thoughts or questions as we have this session, please feel free to use the chat and we will do our best to get to as much as possible. All right, with that being said, I'd like to also turn this over to our other panelists for introductions as well. Pam?
Hey everyone, my name is Pamela Dean. I'm a board certified neuropsychologist at the Seattle VA and an assistant professor at University of Washington and also a member of the EAC. Emily?
Hi there, my name is Emily Trichu and I think I'm unmuted right now. Is that good? Good. Sorry, had a little box popped up, said I was still muted. I am also a neuropsychologist and I am also at the VA Puget Sound Healthcare System and cross-appointed at the University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry there. I'm pleased to be part of this today. We have a 2-year fellowship at our facility. And also, luckily, I have some experience at a few other institutions as well along the way, as I know the rest of the panelists do too. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Duggan. You guys get to see my name all the time as ANST chair, hopefully not too annoying. I'm also a postdoctoral fellow here in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. I'm just really happy that ANST and the Education Advisory Committee of SEN could come together to do this session today. So with that, why don't we get started? And Scott's going to kind of guide us through the questions here, and we'll have our panelists kind of tackle them as we go along.
Okay, so I'm going to try to do these in some semblance of an order with some organization. And the first set of questions that we received have to do first and foremost with what clinical training and looks like essentially, really, in clinical service in general at your different institutions. I will say that one of the overarching themes that you'll hear, whether we're talking about clinical training and education specifically, or we are talking about licensure or differences across the states, one of the themes is going to be that there are differences, right? That there are some commonalities, obviously, in terms of our experiences with COVID right now, but how each institution is handling the particular situations and how states will be handling the situation. There's going to be some variability there. We can get into that a little bit as we go along. But I want to say that at the outset because I do recognize the anxiety around this situation and the preference for most of us, right, to have one particular answer that suits all of us for all these questions. And unfortunately, that's not going to be the case. But I do hope that we can provide some information that will be of use and applicable within your specific training environments. So, on that note, some of the questions that we had were related to what's actually happening with clinical services. Are there, what do clinical services and therefore clinical training look like at these postdoc sites across the country? Are folks doing telemedicine? If they are, what does that look like? Emily, do you have some thoughts on this?
Sorry, that was perfect timing. The geriatric pooch was sleeping in this room and started banging her head against the door to get out. So apologies for that delay. This is the new world. This is my new life. It's not the dog, it's the kids. I think it's really interesting. I think I'm sure a lot of you are experiencing this, but almost every day we're kind of like having to keep our knees bent and adjust what we're doing. And it's taking an incredible amount of energy just to keep up with changing guidance for how to provide clinical care. I do think probably there's a number of you that are doing your fellowships in a VA setting. And so luckily there is some filtering down of some similarities in guidance. Personally, for me, I guess I was lucky. I was doing a fair amount of telehealth, at least for feedbacks and interviews and certain things ahead of this. So transitioning to doing some assessment via these, telemedicine, telehealth technologies has just been that one extra step that I sort of started doing, but hadn't really rolled out fully. I think that that's one of the big changes. I noticed that there were some questions about, hey, I'm being deployed or being, redirected in my training to do things other than neuropsych assessment, to do therapy perhaps, or maybe some rehab work. I would highly recommend that everyone that has that opportunity, if possible, to view it as a positive. I think it's a good reminder that a lot of what drew us into this field in the first place was some of the versatility. And yet, when you start getting into postdoc, you're kind of getting this like narrowification of your focus. You're becoming myopic. I even encourage it for people sometimes, but in this case, it's a chance to broaden your lens back up again and think about that broadening of experiences that will make you more marketable in whatever situation, because certainly telehealth technology and video technology for doing therapy and other types of interventions are well supported and can be done kind of throughout this pandemic. Because I turn that over to one of my colleagues. Pam, do you have additional thoughts about clinical training right now, or Scott, do you want to redirect?
Pam, do you have other thoughts?
Just echo a lot of what Emily said, is that, I think I saw a lot of comments, particularly from second year postdocs, who are really concerned about getting that last bit of training in. And, we hear a lot of people talking constantly about the silver lining and looking at the silver lining. And as Emily was saying, I'll just kind of echo that. This is an opportunity to look at the silver lining and think flexibly about how you're able to still provide training, or what that might look like, or how that might look different, or if you're working in a slightly different environment. And within the VA, telehealth does look a little bit different than I think in other areas. They've rolled out telehealth training really quickly to people who were not previously telehealth trained. And I know for myself, I had been trained about 2 years ago for a program I was in, and I hadn't done it ever since. And now I've had the opportunity to see some patients, although it's very different. For me, it looks more like doing clinical interviews and intakes and holding on testing. What do we feel comfortable with doing? What do we not feel comfortable with doing as far as, telehealth and testing? And there's been some great webinars that have been put out lately that are also available for that. But the clinical training has been a big question for a lot of trainees in terms of how to keep their hours up. And the good news is that everybody across the entire country right now is dealing with these same questions and grappling with it, not only from a training perspective, but also as a clinician and what this looks like for our own practices.
Yeah, thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense for me. I'll add to that specifically on the teleneuropsychology front. Even within that, there are wide differences across institutions, not just from a training perspective, but just in terms of how we as clinicians are practicing. So there are folks out there who have really ceased doing all neuropsychology work at this time. They're hunkering down at home, and that might be sort of institution driven or kind of clinician preference, or some combination of both. There are certainly a lot of us who are doing a mixed bag. It may not be full neuropsychological testing via telehealth, but it's clinical interviews and sometimes clinical interviews with brief mental status exams over the telehealth platforms. And then there are certainly folks that have either already been doing or more seamlessly have transition to doing more really teleneuropsychology in its full extent over, really adapted that over the short period of time. So there's a wide variety of practices. We had colleagues on yesterday during our intern session, and their practice is really focusing on not teleneuropsychology from the way that you might think about it in terms of a sort of a testing perspective, but really from an intervention perspective. I believe it was called the rehab stabilization. So here we're looking at our caseloads and essentially triaging individuals, making contact via telehealth, and understanding where these folks are at, and providing intervention services to help them both, not just from a cognitive, but really from a mental health standpoint during this time of need, and essentially creating a bridge to when the time might come where we can get these folks back into clinic, be it the neuropsychology clinic or psychiatry or neurology practice or otherwise. So I think there are a lot of services that are occurring out there. My expectation is that these are going to evolve and broaden over time, as your faculty members, your training supervisors, or training directors really begin to make their adaptations themselves, I really would encourage you to be in close communication with them to see how you can be part of that process, right? So this is a time of challenges, but I fully agree with Emily's comment as well, that this is a time to take our challenges and look at how we can turn them into opportunities and into positives. And I think when you can be creative about either capitalizing on opportunities that might exist within your training sites, or creating your new opportunities to engage in some of these clinical practices, that will be a significant boon not only to the patients and communities that we serve, but to your training and development as psychologists. So I think there's certainly variability, but there's a lot of opportunity that's out there, and I think more to come.
Scott?
Please.
I was going to say one thing, in case anyone has supervisors who are actually feeling like, sometimes you can tell your supervisor's at a loss as well. One area of my clinical practice that's actually always been a small part, but is now very large, are my non-visit consults. So I work in a geriatric specialty clinic. I get these consultations. I'm not seeing any veterans face-to-face right now, but a lot of times these consults come in, and if I start doing a thorough chart review, my knowledge as a neuropsychologist allows me to identify things that the providers have missed that could be affecting cognition. I don't pretend to know everything about medications, but I can recognize a handful of cholinergic medications. And sometimes I'll just triage on then to a pharmacist for expert drug review, or recognize that maybe that thyroid problem, the numbers have been looking bad lately, and that in combination, say, with untreated sleep apnea is having an effect on this recent decline in thinking. So sometimes if there's the ability to do sort of that non-visit consult, again, not saying that in-person evaluation isn't necessary, but helping providers that are also struggling right now come up with ways to support families, suggest additional workup, get some of those rule outs done if possible in the interim.
Yeah, thank you for adding. That's a great thing to mention too. And I think another way where, again, if we're being creative and proactive as trainees, where you really might be able to not only develop your knowledge base and skill sets, but be really an incredible asset to your team. We all know that we work from time to time with patients who really have no need to see neuropsychologists, right? They're just not appropriate evaluations, and they, for whatever reason, they fall through the cracks, which is really a burden on the broader healthcare system, as a whole. And if we think about how this time is going to put most of our institutions really in a pretty critical backlog in terms of our wait list, if we can do good work to make sure that we are funneling patients in for evaluations in an appropriate manner, triaging them, screening out those who don't need to be seen, making sure we're flagging those with actually critical or emergent issues, whether that be for us or to, as Emily was saying, to make sure that they're referred elsewhere, either for teleconsults with other services, or to be sort of first on the list when they come back in for when neuropsychology clinics open up. These are incredibly important things that oftentimes there's not enough person power to do. So for trainees to be able to step into those roles and assist their divisions and departments in those areas would be, I think, critically important and quite valuable, and certainly accountable, if you will, in terms of your clinical hours. Switching gears just a little bit, we had a question or two related to training about, there are folks out there that I realize that have, not necessarily, shut down, and that are still seeing people in person. So there's been questions about it, if you're found in that particular position, what are your rights and sort of responsibilities? This gets a little bit tricky because of what I was speaking to earlier, where each institution essentially, and with postdocs, and invariably you are going to be found as sort of an employee of the institution, either in the particular academic school or the VA or otherwise. So therefore, really regulated through those institutional mandates. So when we kind of broaden things out and we look at other professional organizations, whether that's APA or COA or different training councils, specialty organizations like Division 40 or otherwise, those, we can get into a place where we can provide statements of support or guidance or recommendations, but we don't have any legal mandate or power, I should say, to mandate what happens at an individual level within a particular institution. That being said, I think and if you've read the statements that have come out, I think there is a groundswell of support for most of us that we need to be prioritizing not just our patient population, but our trainees and students more than anything. And if you look at the APEC website, there's some good information there that really gets at this idea about being able to balance out the need to service the community, but prioritizing our students and trainees. So on that note, I think one of the most important things that we can do, or I suggest that you do as trainees, particularly if you're in a situation where you're feeling that you may be pushed to provide services that you may feel uncomfortable with, I think communication has to be foremost. That needs to be communicated and discussed very directly with your training director and our supervisors and other mentors as well. And if there are issues that are happening during or with that conversation, there's still sort of a degree of uncomfortability. There are other resources through APIC and otherwise where you can go to reach out and have other means of support and guidance. But I think the first step certainly needs to be that communication with your direct training director, who, given their particular role, has responsibility to protect you as students during your tenure.
Thank you, Scott. I just wanted to add also that we've been in contact with some of the professional specialty organizations in terms of mechanisms to ensure students can have feedback. You all likely saw the AACN trainee survey that just went out. We are kind of in communication with them about the survey also. And if you didn't do it already, I highly recommend that you submit your experiences on the survey in an honest fashion. This is going to be one of the driving factors, kind of helping the leaders in our profession kind of understand of how to guide training directors and supervisors in how to respond to what you guys are experiencing right now. And they really want this data. So they're hoping to have a very fast turnaround. So if you haven't done it yet, try to do it as soon as possible. I think they're hoping to finish collecting data within the next few days by Wednesday. So that's another mechanism. And as I become aware of other mechanisms to submit anonymous questions or other concerns, I'll let you know. But the kind of personal mechanisms are the ones that Scott talked about.
Emily or Pam, do you have other thoughts about how best to approach communication about services? Because I mean, for me, what comes to mind is not just an issue about providing clinical services during this immediate time right now, but I think the broader issue for most of us, and this is not just training specific, but this is, you know, us as clinicians in general, or what is it going to look like as we phase back into clinical care, right? I don't think anybody really believes that we're just going to, you know, when we're back to work, we're just going to show up day one and things will be back to normal. It is most likely that your institutional policies are going to have some phase in where, and it's going to look different, but there might be a period where you're wearing a mask for a period of time, or you're providing services in a way that just fundamentally looks different and was different than what you were doing before, as a bridge to getting back to, you know, care as normal, if you will. So I think if we think about that transition phase, there's going to be a lot of questions there about, you know, what are your responsibilities, and what, you know, what can you do, and how can you advocate for yourselves, while also, you know, recognizing this need to service our patient population. You know, as I said, I think that communication is going to be critical, because really the questions you have are the same as your training directors and most clinicians and faculty that are working in these institutions as well. But Pam or Emily, do you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, the other thing I would just add to, not only just about how important communication is, but if, you know, one of the things that this has been really scary for all of us, you know, are we going to get it? Is someone who is living in our house going to maybe bring it home? There's so many unknowns about this. So not only are there the questions about our delivery of clinical care and clinical services and graduation and what this is going to look like for board certification down the road, but just the practicality of our own fears and discomforts of providing services, being in this environment. And so, you know, if you have any conditions, any medical conditions or anything that you're concerned about, while you may not have disclosed that to your supervisor, if this is a big concern for you, I would encourage you to maybe start having a conversation with a supervisor that you trust, going to your training director and just talking about what, you know, are possible options or things. Just at least, you know, having that conversation and feeling supported is a really good place to start. And if you're not feeling supported within your institution, then reaching out to one of the mentorship, but, you know, if you have a mentor outside of your institution, or there's mentorship programs that are also available. So you're not feeling like you're having to, you know, kind of go the course alone. A lot of people are in similar situations, but there are other resources that are available for you. But the biggest and the first line is to have that conversation with your supervisor and your training director.
And I would simply add, I think, you know, you're saying this, Pam, health conditions is pretty all-inclusive, right? I think a lot of us, our curiosity, and not necessarily me, but, you know, curiosity about the brain and emotional health come from having some personal experiences in this area. And so you might be someone who's been able to manage your anxiety or other things throughout your training without as much difficulty. And now maybe there's triggering events that are going on. So just keep in mind that at the end of the day, your health is, and those of the people, the patients around you and whatnot, that's more important than a workup for mild cognitive impairment in a moment. I think also I was going to add, you know, and sort of Scott, you hinted at this, the world of neuropsychological evaluation may be very different next fall, next year, whenever. I think about a lot of the handheld tests like the Boston naming test, R-band stimuli books, all these things that just aren't cleanable, not in the way that they need to be. It's always been an issue in my mind, but I'm kind of old school. A lot of that's going to change. If you are in a situation where you're either phasing back into testing or needing to do some now, think about ways that you can distance, limit the number of measures you're giving where you actually need to be touching anything that they're touching. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point here we have plexiglass shields set up with openings at the bottom for exchanging things as needed with patients, the same way most grocery stores have set those things up for their clerks. So in the short term, if there's any thoughts you have that would make you feel more protected in the moment doing patient care, or even if you're being pulled into meetings where you have to sit in a room with a bunch of people, that you could actually be doing it via some other technology and be distanced, it's all about that time face-to-face that we're trying to reduce. So think a little outside the box and crowdsource for what other people are doing too. I'm amazed at how many interesting suggestions and ideas I've heard generated on different listservs.
Thank you.
Can I just add one other thought to piggyback on that, Scott? You know, going back to what Emily was saying, you know, again, we're supervisors, training directors, the people who are in the executive committees of the leadership, you know, within our associations. We're all grappling with how to deal with this, how to move forward, how to provide these services. And sometimes trainees have really great ideas, but you feel that there's a power differential that you can't bring it up because you're, you know, maybe you're a first year postdoc or you don't feel comfortable to say these things to your supervisor or whatnot. But, you know, again, coming back to that communication piece, you might have an outstanding idea or concern or something. And so, you know, feeling empowered to at least bring that up in a respectable way to your supervisor or your training director. And that may be, you know, something that is a jumping off point.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to switch gears a little bit. I know we have a lot of other areas that we want to cover today too. So I just want to shift gears a little bit because there's questions obviously about, you know, how will this change in our training impact our, you know, our postdoc hours and maybe our postdoc positions as a whole. All right. So, you know, specifically, how will COVID impact their ability to complete our hours for fellowship, and what will fellowships be doing to sort of flex or accommodate, you know, those in training right now. You know, here's another area where I think it's going to vary by institution, because each institution, regardless of whether they are, you know, sort of a guild membership site or not, really is responsible for their trainees. And at the end of the day, they're responsible for signing off, not just in terms of, you know, how much work, you know, the countable hours, if you will, but really has a trainee achieve the level of competencies and with respect to their knowledge and skills base that we would feel comfortable in allowing that individual to move forward for independent practice. So while I do think and I understand while it's easy for us to think in terms of hours, when we can, what I would encourage most of you to do is think not in terms of time and hours, but in terms of competencies, okay? And that I think is gonna be more, it's gonna be of greater benefit to you, and I think it's gonna be more practical and reasonable to have those conversations both in the short term and the long term, right? Yeah, I personally, you know, as somebody who's been in training for a while, I'm training director of a fellowship site now, you know, I don't know what 200 hours in this versus 225 hours, like I don't know what that means, but I do know when somebody has good skills and good knowledge base, right? So we need to be thinking about ways that you can utilize your time on training right now to further develop those core competencies. And again, that will be somewhat site specific. It might be possible that you finish that within the 2-year time frame that you had initially set out because of certain adaptations your fellowship has made to the provision of clinical care. For others, whether it is institutional or personal need at this point in time, it might be considerations of extending fellowship, right? I think that's at the end of the day actually going to be a little bit less important in terms of our calendar days, as opposed to how are you utilizing your time well, okay? So I think really, you know, the timeline perspective will be something that you should be talking about already with your training directors. You know, it's not that they're unaware of these conversations, but if you're sitting there having those questions and are not having those conversations, you should. You know, again, going back to, I think one of our core tenets, communication is going to be important. So start now and don't wait longer to figure out what needs to be done. If there's already thoughts on their end about extending the postdoc, or again, getting back to our earlier conversation, how can you be creative in your using your skills right now to still you know, develop those competencies and meet the expectations of the fellowship within the original time frame. And I think in a lot of cases that's going to be quite achievable, but it's going to be a lot easier if you're proactive in those conversations. Other thoughts on that?
That was well put.
Okay.
One thing that I can maybe just add is, for example, for me on postdoc right now, one of the things that I've done with my training director is kind of make a plan for what it is that I'm doing with my time. And so I'm documenting the different projects, whether I'm devoting a little bit more time to research or a little bit more time to this and that, but I'm still working towards all of the competencies that they want me to develop over a postdoc. And honestly, some of it is kind of nice because I wasn't able to spend so much time doing certain activities that I really wanted to do on my postdoc. So now I'm getting the chance to do some of that. And so as long as I'm doing that, and then Scott had kind of highlighted, but I'll just highlight again, that is make sure that you document everything. Document how many hours you spend, document all the outcomes, and all of the new skills that you're doing, all of these additional webinars. Keep track of that. These are all didactics, and you, in tandem with your supervisors, are developing new competencies in all sorts of areas that will make you leaders for the future of what neuropsychology is becoming.
And with that, and also piggybacking on Scott's comment, unlike applying for internship or even in some ways applying for a fellowship, it's not really as much about these numbers. It's this competencies. It's your narrative, right? A prospective employer, putting myself in their shoes. It's about how you've developed as a professional. What skill sets do you have? And this is, in the actual numbers of cases seen, it's going to be a little less important. Hopefully second years have already gotten a lot of kind of the traditional neuropsych already under. They're, already taking care of that. In first years, I mean, we're going through this now, but hopefully our second year is going to be a bit more normal. The new normal perhaps, but still a bit more normal. I really liked what you said, Emily, about kind of documenting it, because if you're a first year, remembering how to explain this time period in over a year is going to be a little hard. And as a second year, you might feel so deeply in it that it's hard to kind of process and put together, again, your narrative. Who are you? What's your professional viewpoint? And why are you an asset that someone should hire?
And I'll just kind of piggyback on that too, that this is, again, looking at the silver lining of this. So obviously your clinical hours have gone down from what you were doing before, but that doesn't mean that you still can't get experiences with different clinical populations through reading, through, this is a great time to really learn about different conditions that you may have seen once or may have heard about, maybe haven't heard about. This may be more of a time to work through research, but documenting all of those hours and all of those activities is going to be really important. And again, those ongoing conversations with your training director as to how your time looks.
Yep, that's a nice segue. Emily, maybe I can turn this back over to you to talk a little bit about some of the other specific didactic and scholarly resources that are available and that are in development through ANST and the EAC for individuals who are looking at how to really make the most out of their time right now.
Sure. So ANST, along with a lot of other organizations and SCN, and we feel your pain. I feel your pain every day. I'm living your pain with you. And we're acutely aware of all the kind of lost opportunities for learning and working to find ways to create resources. So I'll tell you about a few initiatives that are happening right now. First, I'll start with kind of the SCN ANST things. If you haven't accessed it yet, the ANST Google Doc that we've created has a very comprehensive list and links to all sorts of resources in all sorts of area, whether it's kind of as we're getting these organizational statements from APA, APIC, ASPPB, like all of these different places that we're putting those statements there, all the way down to sources for didactics and training and telehealth resources. One of the next things that we've been doing is, this is not an ANST or an SEN initiative per se, but it's one that we're certainly in support of, is the newly launched Neuropsychology Didactic Series. So you probably saw this coming across your email. And it's a number of people that we've come together to create a free didactic series for trainees like you to continue to broaden your training and meet those needs that are maybe not being able to be met by your institution right now. Those didactics are going to focus on 4 key areas, including kind of clinical issues, clinical patients and neuroanatomy, things like that, assessment issues, research, and professional development. And if we're going back to what Scott was talking about before in terms of competencies and documenting and kind of finding the holes in your training, those are key areas of competency that you're going to need to meet in your postdoc years. So kind of finding didactics that fit those will be important for you. Our first one in this series is starting on Monday. It's a talk on epilepsy. I'll put the links in here in a moment when I'm done talking for you to have access to. Another thing that we're really aware of, and many of you on postdoc, maybe this isn't affecting you quite in the same way, but maybe you have colleagues or maybe you're hoping to kind of have more research going on, but we're aware that all research activities are more or less suspended for many of us. And this can be affecting your career trajectories of wanting to apply for grants soon. And so what we're in the process of doing is sending out a call to the broader neuropsychology community for basically amassing a database of resources for trainees in this time. So this includes things like data sets that are freely available, data sets that can be accessed through a user agreement, faculty who have already collected data that has not been analyzed, and they're willing to kind of work with you on an individual basis to collaborate and give you access to that data. So the second phase of this that's going to come out shortly after we're done collecting this information is calls for people who are in need of these resources so that we can kind of match them with the appropriate information. So be on the lookout for more of that to come. Again, on that Google Doc, we have links to, like, for example, if you're in need of telehealth, teleneuropsychology resources, there is is it the IOPC? I can't keep track of all the acronyms now. Okay, and that is a tremendous resource. APA has tons and tons of resources as well. I'm trying to send them out to you guys on kind of a weekly basis or so, so I'm not flooding your inboxes.
Thank you, Emily. So yeah, so I mean, long story short, there are a host of scholarly opportunities, educational opportunities that exist directly in this world of teleneuropsychology right now, but certainly more broadly than that, and then a whole slew of other scholarly activities that are forthcoming. So I really do encourage you, regardless of whether you sort of have stopped pretty much all clinical work at this point in time, or you're somewhere in the middle, to really be thinking about how you can engage in those activities, and then getting back to again what we were saying earlier, thinking creatively. Okay, so how do you join with your peers at your site or across sites and do virtual journal clubs, right? How do there are a lot of things that you could do to stay sort of intellectually engaged that will honestly be very good in terms of developing your competencies, and probably pretty good just from a mental health standpoint if you're finding yourself going nuts just staring at your 4 walls. So I think doing those things creatively is going to be important. Documenting that, as we said, is going to be critically important. Again, short-term and long-term. A lot of our questions, which we'll turn to, get at this notion of what do we need for hours for licensure and for board certification. And in many ways, what we're really going to be focused on, particularly on the board certification front, is going to be those competencies. So if you can demonstrate that this is, you've done these journal clubs and you've done these online didactic series, and you can very easily demonstrate how that fits into the sort of your training path thus far, I really do believe that you're going to be in quite a good position, and there's not going to be that much issue there down the road. So
can I add 2 cents in there as well?
Please.
So another way to look at this is a really nice opportunity to start building your binders for board certification too, and using those didactics, those readings, those articles, So not, I mean, really board certification is all about demonstrating what your entry-level competencies are in clinical neuropsychology. So not only is this a great thing to do during your postdoc because it helps grow your knowledge base in those competencies for, graduating from neuropsychology from your postdocs, but also you can think of this as preparation for boards. And so you can make yourself a binder, or if you're, I'm an old-fashioned paper pencil person, and I have, 2 gigantic binders when I was doing my prep, but maybe you're a computer person and you can start, a file on your computer.
Yeah, thank you. So if that, so hopefully that's provides some clarity on some of these questions that came through with board certification, but maybe even to be in interest of trying to be even a little bit more direct, I don't think necessarily that this reduction in sort of our traditional face-to-face clinical neuropsychology experience is going to put you at jeopardy for board certification. Okay, and that's for many reasons. It's again because we're not bean counting at this point in time. We're worried about and thinking about competencies. It's also because in a very genuine sense, the board is interested in having folks come through who are eligible, sign up, and achieve board certification. Right? Its intent is not to be exclusionary, but quite the contrary. So there are extensive conversations that are happening right now on this front through ABPP. Everybody's well aware of what's going on and how this is going to impact our training, really across the board for postdocs and interns and otherwise. So when it comes time to apply and sit for boards, you're not going to be out there on an island where you're trying to sort of demonstrate or explain away your experiences in these particular times to people who are unaware of what your experiences were. You're all going to be in the same boat, and there's going to be firm understanding as to how training was disrupted and was altered at this point in time. So I honestly, from knowing the board and having some conversations with the folks over there recently, I don't think that in and of itself is going to be a particular issue. If you're an individual who thus far has developed the core competencies that have, gotten you to your fellowship, right? Now you've had the coursework and the training necessary, and this is sort of your last, last training. We're always training, but sort of this last formal training phase. If that's where you are now, if that's where you were 2 months ago before all this started, then you're already going to be in a good position, right? You have to think about it in that big scope too, where this is one period of your training, and it feels large and crazy right now because it is crazy. But this period is one period of your broader education and training, curricula or CV, if you want to kind of think of it that way. So there'll be full understanding about that. And when you sit down for your boards, you sit down, for eligibility, we're just going to want to know what it is big picture. And if you can tell that story, which I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are able to do at this point, you're still going to find yourselves in a good position.
And if you need a little bit of that extra reassurance, the executive committee for ABCN did post a letter to postdocs in training on the abcn.org website. So if you need a little bit of reassurance of that, you can read the letter that was written by the executive committee.
So taking that maybe just a half step forward too, thinking not just about board certification, but fundamentally licensure. There's the questions that come through about hours for licensure. I want to go big picture with that first, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, because when we start getting into licensure, that does shift the conversation from what we've been discussing thus far, right? So we think about your clinical training and education, and we think about competencies and how the specialty has defined competencies. That's different than licensure. So each state and each territory, if we're talking about Canada, has their own legislation around who does and does not qualify to get licensed as a psychologist. Okay, So there's not uniformity, as I'm sure you know, across the states. It's a regulatory issue that comes down to, you know, a government, not really a professional guild issue at all. So as it has always been, you know, the licensing laws are different by the states, and that remains true in this time of COVID, and it's going to remain true tomorrow. Each state, you know, some of the biggest differences that you'd be kind of faced with are, you know, how many hours does one need for licensure? Does an individual need to have a formal sort of supervised postdoc and have hours be counted in during that postdoc experience in order to get licensed? And again, those are differences across the states. Most of the time within neuropsychology, we're actually a little bit more protected from some of these differences because we are doing 2-year postdocs, which pretty much by definition is going to mean that you're going to accumulate the hours necessary for licensure. Now, understandably, the question in this time is, you know, are you still going to be able to kind of prove that you have those hours when it comes to, you know, face-to-face time? And again, each state is thinking about this. We had a conversation yesterday where it came up that the presidents of the 50 state associations within APA are getting together. They've put a letter together to make it clear to each legislative body, basically the jurisdictions themselves that regulate licensing, that this is an issue that is going to be in need of address. And I think that's important and will be helpful. But I can also say that the jurisdictions also already are quite aware that this is something that is going to need to be handled. Right now, I think where things are at are because nobody knows what's happening with the virus and whether there will be a return to work in sort of the near future or how long this would be extended. You have jurisdictions who are essentially going to not want to make significant changes in terms of their requirements, for fear that there may not need to be if people are back to work pretty soon. But you also want to keep in mind that from a practicality standpoint and from a government and economic standpoint, that there is going to be an incredible need. There is now in terms of having everybody who's in training, psychologists who are in training enter the workforce, right? There's a shortage of mental health services in this country, and that's true, period. But if you think about what COVID has done in terms of really having drastic increases in terms of mental health crises from anxiety, depression, substance abuse, domestic violence, excuse me, the need is going to be even greater. So there's going to be a significant impetus from that standpoint to make accommodations to have individuals out there who are competent, who are ready to be licensed. I wish I was in a position where I could say, for each of you who are looking to get licensed in each of these states, this is exactly how it's going to go. I can't do that, but every indication has been from all of our particular organizations and the jurisdictions themselves that there is going to be flexibility and attention to this issue so that we can keep a good pipeline from the student to early career workforce.
I think I'll just add one other thing. I added a link for you guys to the ASPPB resource page, and I just wanted to also share that for anybody who's in the process of licensure right this minute, I have heard from some colleagues that different states are kind of getting creative and meeting and having emergency meetings to find ways to continue the licensure process as soon as possible. Many people have asked about EPPP and how that schedule is being affected and delays. For EPPP, my understanding is that a lot of the EPPP scheduling has been delayed. If you've already taken it and you're on kind of the next step, whatever that is for your state or province or territory, that some places are arranging virtual, like oral examinations or ethics examinations, whatever your jurisdiction has. So they are trying to find ways, and I think this will start to trickle into other states if it hasn't trickled into your state yet or jurisdiction. I know that as far as the EPPP goes, it's hard to get clear in rapid communications about that. I was in the process of starting to prepare for EPPP right now, and I know that that's been derailed. Luckily, I'm kind of going into my second year of fellowship coming up, and so there's still time. We still have time for these things, and they're going to find ways to get us back on track for that. Right now, I think that'll be okay.
Thank you. I just want to say out loud again that, I noticed that some of what we're saying, hopefully some of it's helpful, but I also know that some of it still leaves some ambiguity out there because that is a situation. And I just want to acknowledge the anxiety that I know a lot of you are feeling in this situation, and reiterate some of the points that were made earlier that A, that's normal, and B, and maybe most important, is we want to make sure that you're attending to your own needs, particularly your well-being and mental health needs at this point in time as well. So while we can't wipe away the uncertainty around licensure and jobs at this time, we do strongly encourage you to do whatever you need to do to support your own well-being. And if that includes reaching out to us directly for support, please do so. The last thing that I think, last area I would say that we really want to touch on, which we're just sort of getting up to, is the effect on jobs, particularly for second years. And so, a lot of comments came in really to the same effect about, what does this mean for my job prospects, and what can I do? It is true that there are many institutions, academic institutions certainly, but some broader than that given the crisis have essentially found themselves in a position where they're hemorrhaging, millions of dollars seemingly on the day. And because of this, these institutions are in a place where they are sometimes furloughing their own staff, but also having hiring freezes. Okay. So that is a very real situation. Okay. There's not one way to deal with that. The best thing that I can recommend for individuals is to be as active right now with your search process. Okay, so it's really going to vary on institutions in terms of whether they're on a hiring freeze at all. If they are, if that's like a 3-month freeze or a 6-month or a year freeze, or something in between. I would make this recommendation if we weren't in a hiring freeze with COVID, but in terms of being active and really proactive in sort of your search for jobs. But now I think all the more important. So I'm sure most of you in the second year are already in this process. And I would say that given where we're at in this time, particularly if you're finding yourself at home with things, looking for things to do, that what better thing to do than to prioritize your own future, right? And that includes really spending a lot of work on the job front. And so not just looking at the sort of the common resources or the sort of job directories, but going through and doing the cold calls, reaching out, using your network to see who might be hiring, and if there are jobs that were out there that you were aware of, interested in, to have very frank conversations with them about how this is impacting their hiring process. There's no reason you can't ask those questions. You should not feel uncomfortable doing so, and you're going to be able to get an answer one way or another. And at the very least, you just need to be in a position where you know what's happening within that institution about their hiring process. But sitting in the dark with those questions is not going to help you at all. So again, be proactive, reach out, use your networks, and find out who and who is not hiring. Because while there is this change in the landscape, it doesn't mean that all institutions have stopped their process, not by any stretch. So it just means that we might have to get a little bit more creative about what that job looks like for you, and where you go for that first position next year. Pam or Emily, do you have other thoughts on jobs?
I was going to say that I think this is a great time to become someone who really knows the various technologies available. Make yourself super attractive as a new position candidate. If I were even close to retirement age at this point, I promise you, I'd be thinking this was my little nudge that direction. There is going to be a drop off of folks practicing neuropsychology who were, unfortunately, sadly, either out of business from private practice due to this or considering it anyway. So I really think the job volume is going to be there. But as sort of Scott said, it may not be there quite in the manner you expected. And it may not be quite as fast as you want, but I still think there's going to be a lot of positions available. There's also, for folks that are doing well or were doing really well, they're going to have massive backlogs. So maybe your first job is a one-year position in a group practice or a hospital setting to contract and work through backlogs. I also would argue that this is a great time to learn about viral effects on brain matter and the consequences of certain types of health conditions across the age span. There are definitely going to be a lot of folks with residual and perhaps developmental difficulties that may be a result of this pandemic. So, you know, I'm not normally a silver lining person, anybody that's on here that knows me, but I really think that there are some opportunities here. It's just hard when we're stuck in this kind of negative space of the day-to-day sometimes to see it. But I really agree. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities there. This is not the death of our profession in a traditional, in its typical sense.
I just want to acknowledge that I think some people are out there, second years, who have geographical restrictions and are hoping to find jobs within the area that they're currently living. And I think that does have an extra level of stress because it takes out the flexibility of being able to move anywhere in the country that has an open position. And I think that that adds a whole other layer of stress and unknowns. So one thing to possibly do is reach out to some of your local neuropsychology associations that are within your region. Do some networking there as well, not only just calling private practices or hospitals or organizations in your area, but reaching out to your local neuropsych association and seeing if you can make some network connections there. Seeing, as Emily was saying, there's, our listservs are talking about what the aftermath of this is going to look like. And some individuals are even seeing, kind of post-COVID cases. And those of us who have had to cancel our in-person evaluations, we already had 6-month wait lists, and now we're going to have those patients on top of it. So it's hard to say what organizations are going to do, and that unknown creates a lot of anxiety, as we know that this time of year is very anxious for graduating postdocs anyway until you have that job secure. And this adds another layer of that. But doing what you can, being proactive, reaching out to your local associations, networking, cold calling, all of those things are going to be helpful for you.
Thanks, Pam. I just wanted to say that I know that it's 6:01. I'm just getting a couple questions in the chat about it. In general, is it too early for first year postdocs to start proactively looking for job positions? I don't know what you guys would say. As far as me being a first year postdoc, also I'm already trying to think proactively about what that might look like for me, where I might want to be, trying to keep track of who seems to be still hiring, who's kind of meeting kind of the niche that I have. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that we commonly get. That's not even necessarily COVID related. But yeah, I think it's never too early to do exactly what you just said, Emily, to think about where you want to go. What is your plan? What's your ideal, and what would be your other options? But what do you want? And how do you sort of get the training and education that's going to allow you to position yourself in a way that you are going to be most likely to see success in achieving that job that you want, right? So I think that's just smart practice in general. But given everything that we just talked about now with the wait lists that are just going to be sky high, this this emergence of sort of teleneuropsychology, this issue about how the virus itself is impacting, cognitive functioning and so on and so forth. All these are going to be areas that are ripe for individuals to create niches in, right? So just like it was when, if you're sitting down with an internship training director for your interviews, or for the postdoc training director for your interviews, when you sit down for your job interviews, the person across the table wants to know, what have you done, right? And essentially at the job level, how do you fit in? What can you add, right? So you craft that story, and you can start crafting that on first year. And if you're a second year, take this time again now to figure out how to craft that story. What can you do to add and help that institution service their needs? And that could be on a research front, it could be on a clinical front, it could be some combination thereof. But what do you bring to the table that is going to make you a good candidate and give them a reason to hire you, whether or not they were ever on a hiring freeze or not? How do you fit in, and how do you sell yourself as somebody who needs to be there? That's how you should be thinking. Nobody's going to make a better argument for yourself, or nobody should be able to make a better argument for yourself than you are. So take a lot of time to think about how to do that. Talk to your mentors about how do you craft that story. Get serious about being self-reflective and figuring out if there are gaps in your training that you can address during this time. And then you go in and you look for those jobs creatively, and you tell those institutions and those faculty who are hiring exactly how you're going to be an asset to their team. And I think if you can go in with that mindset, you're going to be in a good position to get jobs, and not just any jobs, but jobs that are going to be satisfying and meaningful once the time comes, whether that's in a couple months for you, or if it's in a year down the road.
I'll just say it. This is Emily T. I will say it's kind of funny. I'm such a planner. I've been a planner my whole life. If you're getting, toward the end of your first year and you're feeling very secure in your second year of funding and your position, normally I would say, oh yeah, be looking ahead. But if you're trying to homeschool kids, telework, do all these things, and you feel like you're drowning right now, let something go, okay? And frankly, throughout my career, I thought I knew what the next step was, and then I ended up in something somewhat different. And it's amazing how things do work out. Your spouse or partner, or whatever that has a reason why you're geographically locked, that could change too. Their position may suddenly shift to all teleworking. A lot of industries are really going to adjust how they get by. So some of those things that are kind of clouding life for you now or making you worried about the future, it may be so different. So I don't know, I can't believe I'm saying this. I'm not a carpe diem person, but try it. A little, and mindfulness can take some of the edge off a little bit.
Emily, thank you so much for saying that. I want to be really clear my point that, I do firmly believe that, for you, you owe it to yourselves to be thoughtful and proactive. But that is not synonymous with saying that you should take every minute of the day right now to drill yourself into the ground to do, online didactics from the morning, the minute you wake up in the morning to the minute you go to bed, whether or not you have, kids run around or otherwise, right? There are limits, period. And, there's an absolute toll that this situation is taking on all of our individual, mental health, at this point in time. So find that balance there, and you're going to know whether you need to step back or not. So, don't neglect yourself in your training, but put yourself first, because if you don't have your own well-being, then it's all worthless. Okay. So thank you, Emily, for saying that, because I think it is a very critical point.
All right. I know that we're over time here. I think this was a very productive session. We had one last question about, I registered for neuropsychology didactic series, but I haven't received a confirmation yet. Thank you for registering. We have a ton of people who have registered. We're really excited to kick this off on Monday. You'll be getting a link for the Zoom session on Monday very shortly. So that is coming soon.
Okay. I just wanted to end by thanking our panelists for joining us today, who are also working their own butts off with clinical work and families. So I very much appreciate your time here. Emily, our fearless leader of ANST, who I don't know how you do what you do. It is utterly amazing. Thank you for helping us organize this as well. And then for all of you hundreds of trainees out there, our colleagues, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you for taking the time and energy to spend joining us today. I truly appreciate it and value the opportunity to connect with you, even if it is over this sort of faceless mechanism, and genuinely know that we are here to support you. So if there are further questions or needs, certainly feel free to reach out. Otherwise, go home, do some self-care, and have I'm on East Coast time, so I'll say have a relaxing evening. Thank you.